We're just going to give, sorry, folks, another minute to come back from that very brief break, and we'll launch into our policy roundtable. Members of CEPAC, you can go off camera now if you wish. I know you're there as I introduce members of the roundtable. All right, why don't we go ahead? Let's see if everybody is back, though, who needs to be here for the roundtable. I've got Kathy, I've got Michelle, I've got, let's see, is Emily Sow with us yet? I'm not seeing her. So let's just wait one more minute. Oh, there she is. Hi, Emily. Why don't you come on camera? Okay. And I don't know if our clinical experts are back with us yet. Aaron is. All right, let's go ahead and get started. I'm going to introduce some new folks to the conversation. Take another deep breath, because that was a lot. And now we have, in a sense, the future to talk about. So as part of our policy roundtable, we have folks who have been with us all day long. We've got Drs. Bedlack and Lewis. We have our patient experts, Dr. Shamaskin, Joel, and Kathy Collett. And we now have also back with us Dr. Apple from Mitsubishi, who made a public comment, and two representatives, well, not representatives necessarily, but two folks who can share with us the perspectives of the payer community. Emily Sow from Primera. Emily, why don't you just say hi, introduce yourself, since you haven't been on yet.
Good afternoon. My name is Emily Sow, and I am a clinical pharmacist at Primera Blue Cross.
All right. And we have Michelle Rogers. Michelle, why don't you introduce yourself?
Hi, good afternoon. I'm Michelle Rogers, and I am the Director of Clinical Pharmacy at IPD Analytics.
And tell folks who IPD Analytics are. Why would we invite you to this meeting?
So, exactly. We are a consulting firm, a subscription, and we provide insights, cost savings insights to payers, providers, pharma, and health systems.
Right. I have sometimes frame it as we can call on IPD Analytics to be the whisperer to the broader patient community, and sometimes because they have their finger on the pulse of a wide variety of different payers, and try to help understand how payers, again, across a broad spectrum, are going to be thinking about clinical policies and other aspects of their insurance. So, so it's a real pleasure, and thank you for being with us.
Thank you so much.
All of the conflicts of interest, many of them already disclosed this morning, are there on this slide, but I think we can take the slide down now and move into a more free-formed discussion. All right, so I hope you can see me on your single screen with all of the other names kind of sprinkled around. For some reason, I've got Steve on my second. No, I think I can see almost all of you, but please feel free to go ahead and use the hand if for some reason you want to break in. I'm going to be moderating this conversation. Now, again, my job is to try to get us through a lot of different areas. Like we're going to talk about health equity. We're going to talk about coverage policy. We're going to talk about pricing. We're going to talk about the FDA and regulatory processes. And we're going to talk about future research. Each of those could be a 4-hour roundtable or more. So we're going to try to hit the high points and talk again about what perspectives we can gain for policymakers based on the discussion of the evidence and the votes to a certain extent earlier. What are our perspectives on how we move that into practice and into policy in the best way for patients and for the system to try to reach that balance that I was talking about earlier in the day. So I'm going to start off by talking about health equity. In the context of ALS, we can obviously think about, let's assume, just for the sake of argument, that AMX is approved, and so we have another new treatment. But even thinking more broadly about how patients and families are coping with ALS today, what can we together, society, a system, each individual stakeholder, what can we do to improve the health equity associated with care for ALS? What might that look like? Can anybody speak, for instance, to patients who are, much less well off, lower economic resources, people from communities of color? Do they have different kind of access problems than others? Are there different ways we need to think about how to shift our system access around about experts or that kind of thing? So Rick, please help us out to start.
Yeah, I mean, there's no question in my mind that we have a type of ALS care that works better than any other, and that is care in a multidisciplinary clinic where there's a neurologist who's knowledgeable about the disease, about the drugs, about the research, and there's a team of therapists that can systematically assess patients each time they come in. And if they see that the disease is trying to take something away from some body part, they're trained to offer options. And so, we've been focused on two potentially new medications here, oral edaravone and AMX0035, but there's lots of other things that we do in these clinics, ranging from medications to treat symptoms to equipment, power wheelchairs, non-invasive ventilation, exercises, nutritional guidance, lots of things that make a big difference. Unfortunately, we know that about half of everyone with ALS lives more than 50 miles from the nearest multidisciplinary ALS clinic. And that, creates some huge burdens. I mean, for a disease that becomes rapidly disabling, we feel like we're probably only following a fraction of patients in these clinics throughout the disease. We're certainly not following, the great majority of them. And so I would love to see us as a society find a way to either create more clinics or create more access in these clinics, barrier-free access through things like telemedicine.
I was going to ask you about telemedicine. Is it that easy to just have a telemedicine hookup that doctors or their staffs can call into, or is it really having all these different staff there? Telemedicine really isn't going to be the magic difference.
So we learned a lot, Steve, during the pandemic about telemedicine when we were forced to use it as our only means to take care of patients.
Yeah,
we can do multidisciplinary telemedicine. We can measure a lot more things than you might think.
Yeah.
In fact, we even now have a way to measure spirometry, pulmonary function tests, with inexpensive devices that we can train patients to use in their homes. So we can do a lot. The problem is, at the same time that we learned how to do all this stuff during the pandemic receded, and all of a sudden we're getting handcuffed again. States are back to their laws where we can't cross their borders to see our patients unless we have licenses in those states. A lot of insurance companies are changing their rules about which states we can bill in. And so, I mean, as a first step toward more equitable ALS patient care, it would be great to see the United States just decide, hey, we recognize that, there's a model, there's not enough of these types of clinics. A lot of patients are underserved. A simple way to connect them is to just allow telemedicine to cross borders and be paid for by insurance throughout the disease.
thanks. That's a great way for us to start off. Kathy?
I think the biggest travesty in equity in ALS care is the fact that a lot of people don't get diagnosed. Dr. Chelsea Carter of Yale is kind of an expert in this field. She studied a man of color in St. Louis area trying to get diagnosed and then trying to get treated. And it's ridiculous how difficult it was for him to get an ALS diagnosis. And we wonder about how many people there are out there. My mom was a 78-year-old woman. They weren't looking for ALS. I mean, it was a year, and thank God they had good health care. It was a year before we found out that these weren't mini strokes, this was ALS. So I think there's a real problem with people who don't look like Lou Gehrig not being ever diagnosed correctly or being diagnosed very late. Then once the care starts, as Dr. Bidlack said, there are what we call these deserts of care in ALS land. You can't get to a multidisciplinary clinic. And then the fact that there's so little in the physician's toolkits, oftentimes people stop going to clinic just because they can't do anything for me anyway, and there's not much they can do. So it's a real issue. And I think the people who never get diagnosed or who are diagnosed so late that they die very quickly, it's a travesty, and we need to deal with it.
Okay, thank you very much. Aaron?
I think I'm just going to reiterate what Rick said. I think The use of telemedicine over the past few years has really come to fruition, and there are some centers where they do this really well and other where they don't. But it's the primary tool I think we should be trying to expand upon to reach the corners of the country where they just can't see a physician quickly, can't see a physiatrist or a physical medicine specialist, or anyone that participates in ALS multidisciplinary care. I don't know what to do about the payer system in America with this setup, because we can't cross state lines now, and so I can't help to participate in some sponsored program that takes care of patients in rural Kansas that have ALS, and that's a really big problem.
All right. Before I get to Joel and then Stephen, thanks. Is there any best practice out there, whether it's a private insurer or a state that is doing it well, that others could look to at this point? Or is it just all a mess right now with the state laws being universally applied the way they are, and private insurers seem to all be marching to the same tune as far as difficulties with telemedicine? Are there any best practices? Rick or Aaron, why don't I ask you guys on that one first, and then I'll swing.
Go ahead, Rick. I'll go after you.
Yeah, I mean, there's best practices as far as ALS patient care. And then I also think there's best practices evolving as far as what ideal telemedicine looks like. Zach Simmons at Penn State Hershey has done a lot of work with multidisciplinary telemedicine to show, what's capable, the fact that patients are almost equally satisfied when they have a telemedicine visit. The care team feels like they've done almost as good as they can do in person, but of course, without the physical barriers. And there are groups of states that have these interstate compacts. But the thing that's just so frustrating is, during the pandemic, it all just went away. We could see anyone anywhere. And that's still true within the VA system. It doesn't matter what state you have your license in. You can see any veteran for any reason anywhere in the United States. So it just doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me that, right now, all of a sudden I'm handcuffed again, and I've got patients in different states that I'm not supposed to see by telemedicine. Technically, I'm supposed to have a license in all these states, which is going to be virtually impossible for me to have 50 different medical licenses to follow my patients throughout their disease.
It is sad that
seems like a good first
throughout
step.
COVID, where we had to deal with a lot of cross-state issues, somehow we haven't come out of it with a better situation. It is sad.
It got better, but then it got worse again. Now it's getting restricted again.
Yeah. Aaron, did you want to jump in after that before I go to Joel?
Well, I work in the CEPAC system, which is an integrated HMO, and there's a whole bunch of CEPACs throughout California, and they're all integrated so that I can provide care for someone that's 4 hours away from me by telemedicine pretty effectively. We need more of that type of setup to provide care more at distant locations. I do think a lot of ALS care, because patients get so restricted with their mobility toward the later stage of their illness, having telemedicine in general is huge, even for a patient that lives, 5 blocks from my clinic. They just can't get out of their house. And so having telemedicine really helps with that.
Okay. I'm sorry, real quick question for y'all. Again, sorry, Joel, thanks for being patient. Are there standing criteria for a good multidisciplinary clinic? If a health plan wants to set up a network of them for telemedicine, do they have standing? Is there a way to tell a good multidisciplinary clinic from a bad one? Is it just tick this box, you've got this type of staff person, that type of staff person, or is it more than that?
So Steve, the best answer to the question that I know of is the ALS Association has a certification system, and they recognize 2 levels of certification. One is a center of excellence. That means they've actually sent 2 independent reviewers from recognized centers of experts to your site. And those reviewers have sat there throughout the day of your clinic and watched every member of your team in action. And they've certified that, you have all the right disciplines, and those people are very knowledgeable and have a good bedside manner. The second is, just people who have an ALS clinic and can check some of the boxes, but haven't had that site certification. And then, of course, in this day and age, oftentimes the internet, people talk, and on Facebook and Twitter and things like that, people review their doctors and the clinics. But as far as objective certification, the ALS Association is the only one I know that's doing that.
All right, great, thank you. Joel, apologies, thank you for being patient. Go ahead.
Sure. Anecdotally, certainly I can say for me and the friends with ALS I talked with, we didn't feel we slipped or suffered at all during about a year of telemedicine visit. And secondly, currently before Congress is the Connect for ALS Act that seeks to, or a bill that seeks to permanently fund and extend Medicare funding for telemedicine. So that is currently before Congress, and I believe, Dr. Bedlake, maybe you can correct me, I believe it may also address some of the cross-state licensing issues.
Good. All right, we will look into that and make sure it's highlighted in our final report. Thanks. Steve, Apple?
Yeah, so, I think it's incumbent upon industry to be flexible as well. And that can help with a lot of the disparities. I know one of the first things when we were looking at a biomarker study is we engaged Dr. Bedlak and his patient ambassadors so that it would be more equitable. It would be a trial that is more patient-friendly and patient-centric. And then as things moved on and the pandemic came, we had to switch to telemedicine in many instances. We made home blood draws as well as home spirometry for these patients. So as we move forward, and especially for patients that are in later stages and mobility becomes an issue, it's incumbent upon us to really take the patient into consideration as we design new clinical trials.
Good. I want to come back to that too in terms of recruitment strategies, somewhat along the lines of what you're talking about. Great. Kathy?
Thank you. And thank you, Steve. The clinical trial point I think is important because that's not just clinical research. That's also access to experimental things for people with ALS, and it's very important. And it's hard to get in a clinical trial. As you saw from the inclusion criteria, a lot of people are excluded by their state and then their physical location. If you look at where clinical trials are, you want to move to Boston. I mean, it's very difficult to get in, and there aren't enough seats in clinical trials. So the clinical trial aspect, I think, is important. And it's an aspect of patient care, even though it is research. The other thing is to keep in mind with a multidisciplinary clinic, I'm blessed with good health, knock on wood. If I have to go to the doctor and I don't feel like driving, I can call an Uber and get to the doctor's office. You can't do that when you have ALS. It took 2 caregivers to take mom to clinic when she had to go to clinic. And that's 2 caregivers, and it ends up taking most of the day by the time you get ready and get there and get home. So it's a huge investment, and it's not as easy as it sounds. So thank you.
It doesn't sound easy at all. Okay, this is great. I think we've got some good material to work with and to make sure, again, that everything else gets framed in a lens through which we can try to figure out how to work together to improve the aspects of health equity moving forward. So I want to shift over towards starting to talk about coverage. And obviously we can dive into coverage in different directions. I want to start actually, again, taking a step back before we even talk about specific drug criteria or coverage. The way that insurance right now provides services for people with ALS, are there other aspects of their care for which insurance access, either through public insurance, Medicare, or through private insurance, is an issue? Assistive devices, do some insurance cover these caretakers to get people to clinics? Do some insurers pay for travel? Do some insurers pay for home renovation or other aspects of the broader care for patients? Where can we find best practices, or where can we all just say we got a real issue here that we should be all focused on? Rick?
Yeah, thanks for bringing this up. I think it's already been touched on by Kathy, and that is, one glaring hole that we have in the United States is coverage for home health. It's abysmal, and most of us don't know that until we need it. I would say, as far as best practices go, I would look to what's happening at the VA Medical Center for veterans who have ALS and get service connected for it, because they can get not 24/7 care, but a significant amount of home care, as well as home modifications, vehicle modifications. They can often get transportation to and from VA clinics. So that would be where I would look to a best practice right now.
Kathy, before I come to you, do you mind, Emily, can I ask you, does this ever come up? You can even extend it to other conditions if it does, but for ALS, are you aware of private insurers, you guys or others, covering any of these kinds of what some people would call ancillary services?
Steve, this is not an area I've really looked into, but I think that in general, it's very one-off and custom in the commercial line of business. Typically, it's if there is coverage for travel or for home modifications or things like that, it's usually driven by the employer's interest in providing that extra financial resource for those needs.
Would there actually be a separate benefit or just a one-off decision by the employer when faced with a request for coverage, where you would ask the employer and they would say, we'll pay for that on top of our usual insurance payments? Is that the way it would usually work?
You know, you can get a little bit creative with it, but I think what I see most common, and noting that this is not really common to have in your coverage, but typically it falls under the medical benefit, and there may be, a stipend that is available to employees and their dependents that has criteria around it regarding travel or additional medical care in your home that could just be amount of money provided outside of the medical benefit.
Great, thanks. Kathy.
And to emphasize Dr. Bedlack's point, since ALS is a presumptive disability in the VA coverage is to me, that's the one everybody wishes they had. And it's not perfect, but certainly they cover a lot more. We also find out with Medicare, since so many people with ALS have to turn to Medicare, that the home care coverage is not only poor, but there is some, but there's this big gap between the coverage that's there and what home care providers will tell you you're allowed. If they don't want to deliver the care, they tell you it's not covered, rather than telling you it's covered and we don't want to deliver the care. So there's a problem there. Center for Medicare Advocacy has been one of the great advocacy organizations for people with ALS in terms of figuring out this home care mess with Medicare coverage. Thank you.
Great. And by the way, we'll be writing up our kind of policy perspectives shortly after the meeting, but I'd invite any of you to send us links to best practices, papers, other things on some of these issues that we're touching on here where we don't have enough time to really go too deep, but please feel free to send us things that will inform us, but also provide resources for others so that we can include links in our final report. Okay, so again, sensitive to the time, I'm trying to scale this to certain issues. Before I'm going to dive into one drug and then the other, a question will come up about whether the two drugs would be prescribed together. I think we've already heard from clinical experts, and I think at least one of you mentioned that this is kind of expected, that they have different mechanisms of action, or that there would be for this kind of serious condition, rapidly progressive, that you would want to give both drugs at the same time, anything and everything. The usual private insurance model or public insurance model is to be more cautious and to usually not allow dual or combination therapy until there's evidence that the combination is better than one or the other alone. So first, from the clinical experts, will you be, if AMX is approved, will you assume that every ALS expert will be saying, I want that added on to whatever else my patients are taking, if they want to take it? Any clinical reasons that would not be what you think is appropriate? Rick, I bet this is a quick answer.
Yeah, I mean, Steve, it's never one size fits all in this disease, but I think we would all like the opportunity to offer these drugs to patients. And the way that I would explain them is, when we can't find the cause of a person's disease, which is true for 90% of the patients we see, then our best strategy is to hit as many of the downstream pathways that are killing motor neurons as we can. And this is not unique to ALS. This already happens in HIV and oncology and even in epilepsy. They call it rational polypharmacy. And I think this is how we actually get to something that we would all agree is incredibly meaningful slowing, is by hitting a lot of these downstream pathways. So it's exciting to me that there are products with different mechanisms coming to the forefront. I just hope we can get them approved, and I hope we can get them paid for our patients.
Okay, thanks. Aaron?
Yeah, and I'll agree. I think, we heard from patients with ALS earlier about their risk tolerance for new medicines. Their risk tolerance for taking 3 drugs simultaneously is going to be, sure, give it to me. And that's my feeling too, is I don't like to start, 2 drugs simultaneously, but serial introduction of these 3 drugs, so you're dealing with a cocktail of medication for that all act in a slightly different way on the to preserve the motor neurons. That's where we're headed. That's what all of us in ALS care are thinking we're headed towards. Now, the cost and the coverage and the co-pays, that's a bigger issue, and that will obviously play a role in who gets all 3 drugs versus, just Royazole or whatever.
Okay, good. Thanks. Steve?
Yeah, one of the big things that I think we need to talk about is education. I've been at a lot of meetings with payer groups, and there's just a lack of education about ALS. And I've had questions come to me that, oh, so I should only cover the drug if it's definite on the ALS-Scorio criteria. They don't understand what that criteria is. Or if there is a continuation criteria, the patient has to, if they're utilizing a scale like the ALS-FSR, get better. And so I think it's incumbent upon both industry and our clinical group, even though I know your time is short, that we begin to educate, not just on a particular drug, but on the disease state, how we do clinical trials, how patients are diagnosed. The disparity, as Ms. Collette put up, is huge. 12 to 14 months before patients are diagnosed in most cases, and really helping with that. We're working on things like a identification tool that utilizes claims data to help trick flags that, hey, maybe this patient shouldn't be bouncing around the healthcare system, going from family practice to orthopedics or GI, but go to a neurologist who can assess and potentially move that patient to a neuromuscular disease specialist like Dr. Bedlack or Aaron, just so that we have these things in the forefront of our mind as we move forward.
Yeah, and we have seen often that once new treatments start to trickle into an area, effective treatments, it can start to change the basic infrastructure around diagnosis, referral, and care, because initially it's like, what are you going to do for it? There's not much to do, nothing, no 4-alarm fire kind of thing. But the more and more effective treatments become available, that can sometimes create a tipping point. So education is a good idea. All right, I'm going to move to other questions around coverage, some of the ones that Steve raised pretty quickly. So Kathy and then Aaron, go ahead, but we'll try to be quick so I can get to those other issues too. Kathy?
I'll go fast. My nightmare is step therapy. It just, people with ALS don't have time that the person with arthritis has to figure out if A works, then we go to B. So, and then people with ALS, they're trying multiple things today. And I think it's incumbent upon us to make sure that on that mess of things that they have on the kitchen table, that they have FDA approved products. Thank you.
All right, let me swing that down, Aaron, even before you swing down to Emily and to Michelle. One man's rational polypharmacy is another man's evidence-free over prescription. What are insurers going to do with this issue for ALS, do you think? Actually, Emily, Michelle, why don't I start with you, give you a chance. Do you have any sense for what you're guessing will happen if AMX is approved?
Sure. Well, the only thing that we have is evidence from the Centaur trial, right? And in that trial, we saw that the majority of patients were on concomitant therapies, or they were on Royazole or Darabone. So we think, from an IPD perspective, we think that payers will allow concomitant therapies just because that was allowed in the clinical trial. I don't we don't believe there'll be a step through, you have to try riluzole, you have to try this, but we do believe that there'll be, allowed because they're different mechanisms of action, and that was what was allowed in the trial.
Thank you. Emily, any different perspective?
No, I would definitely agree. I think that given the seriousness of the disease, and the fact that the majority of health plans, to my knowledge, will disallow combination use today for riluzole and edaravone, I would agree.
Yeah, and I do agree that the fact that the clinical trial did have, I forget what % of patients were on edaravone anyway, that's another facilitating factor among the others. Aaron, anything also you'd like to add?
Oh, I was just, before this question came up, I would just want to, looking forward, talk about the importance of biomarkers as one of the holy grails of research for diagnosis. We talked about the importance of early diagnosis and how patients are delayed in their diagnosis. We need to fund research into better biomarkers. This has been, a 30-year research project that hasn't reached fruition yet, but that's super important to be able to get diagnostic tools better for clinicians that are neuromuscular specialists at tertiary centers.
Good. And that kind of feeds into the next area I was going to go. Oh, actually, I'm sorry. Before I get into the drug-specific criteria, I wrote down, because this is going to come up most likely, there's something called a new-to-market block, which is a growing activity. It's been used for a long time by insurers. If a drug, as soon as it's approved by the FDA, they put a block on it. It means that they're not going to have a formal insurance coverage policy for somewhere between usually 3 to 6 months. During that time, the assumption is that the insurer needs time to talk to experts, to look at the evidence themselves, and to kind of make a medical policy. And in the meantime, they'll be doing kind of ad hoc, one-by-one coverage decisions, usually just working from a script of the FDA label, but sometimes not. So I'm assuming oral Radicava was approved on May 12th. So I'm assuming that there are a fair number of health plans that are still new to market block on oral Radicava. Michelle, do you know?
I'm not sure of that, but we are starting to see policies already on oral Radicava. So I maybe Emily can speak more to this, but I am aware that does happen. But for oral Radicava, we're already starting to see policies, in place.
Okay. I'm going to go out on a limb and suggest that it's possible that the patient community and clinical experts would view it as a great loss in many ways if the FDA approves a new drug, let's say it's AMX, and then insurance coverage is kind of gummed up for 6 months through some kind of tactic, if you will, or approach that could be considered stalling. Again, it was created, the idea was created because it does take time, especially for rarer diseases that health insurers are not as familiar with, where the evidence might be much more complicated for them to understand. For them to come up with a full coverage policy will take time. But I think best practice might be preparing in advance so that there is as short as possible a new to market block when you've got a rapidly progressive kind of fatal condition like this. Anybody want to argue against that general position? The hands up, I assuming, are not going to argue against that. You probably just want to hit that nail with your hammer. So Aaron, go ahead.
I was on a call last week with the ALS Association Golden West chapter of physicians, and we were talking about the problems of getting oral edaravone for patients. And a number of the community physicians that were on the call who had patients who are currently on IV edaravone were completely unable to get the oral drug to their patients. So they had to keep the patient on IV indefinitely because they have no resource and they've not been told any time when it'll become authorized and approved for them. Real problem.
Rick.
Yeah, I mean, I would just agree. I would go so far as to say that insurance companies, with all the red tape and nonsense that they put us through to get drugs that are FDA approved for patients with a disease where we have literally nothing else to offer them that slows progression, it's actually harming patients. And, the evidence for that is pretty clear. It's right there in the AMX 0035 trial. The patients in that trial who got started on AMX 0035 sooner did better. Their progression was slower. They lived longer than the patients who had a 6-month delay. And it's a matter of months now to get this oral Radicava for patients. It's unbelievable how difficult it is. And that's harming patients. And I hope it doesn't happen with AMX 0035.
Okay, thank you. Kathy?
People with ALS live on something called the ALS clock, and they're losing function every day. I mean, every day, and they're dying every day. And to me, to horse around was something that you could have figured out weeks ago, and to horse around is just, it's not acceptable. It's a stall. Also, I was a person who was taught to wait your turn. And when mom got sick, I'd call to make appointments, and we had to get a augmented communication device. Her speech was going really fast. So I call the place that's going to do the evaluation, and they go, next available appointment's 5 weeks. And it's like, you don't understand.
Right.
You don't understand. And it just, healthcare needs to understand, including payers, that we're dealing with the ALS clock, and I'll wait my turn, but when you have ALS, you go to the front of the line.
Thanks. I like that term, ALS clock. I can only imagine what it must feel like inside the family as that's ticking. Joel?
Most people with ALS are very engaged in what's going on with a drug prior to approval. So they're going to be very ready to step up and do whatever it takes to seek the approval, go to their doctor, work with the insurance company to get their prior auth, which is what I did with the oral Radicava. So I think the fairness issue with any policy that would delay the availability, I think is really important.
Okay, thanks. I'm going to go out on another limb around oral Radicava because as it moves from IV treatment to oral treatment, it's possible that in some insurance systems, the cost sharing asked of patients will go up as it moves from IV to oral. Now, Medicare is capped, out of pocket now at $2,000 per year, but that may not be the same if patients are on commercial insurance. So I'm going to suggest that insurers should look carefully at their out-of-pocket policies, so that if patients want to switch from IV edaravone to the oral edaravone, that they don't face a much steeper out-of-pocket burden, because that would only also kind of enhance the inequities. We know that it would hurt patients who are at the lower economic end of the scale more if they have to pay more out of pocket. Emily or Michelle, do you see any problem with our making that kind of recommendation? Payers may already be all over that, but I think it's a risk if they're not aware, if they're not thoughtful of moving patients from an IV to an oral treatment. Okay. Nodding agreement. Rick, I'm going to assume you're going to nod even harder than I am on that one. So I'm going to pass because I want to get to the drug criteria by criteria. Now, again, partly we do this because this does reflect how insurance coverage policy works for any drug. They walk through a section of their policy on diagnosis. They may have age restrictions. They may have clinical eligibility criteria. They may have criteria around which doctors can prescribe it, for how long, and whether you have to get approval to get it renewed. This is part of almost every single new specialty or expensive drug insurance policy. So there's nothing new about that here. And I want to kind of walk through, though, each of these categories and try to get some perspectives on what it might look for AMX and for oral edaravone, so we can provide some perspectives on certain ways to do it, not to do it, or just at least kind of pros and cons of different approaches. So let's talk about AMX first. So put AMX in your mind and let's assume it's approved. So let's start with diagnosis. We're familiar, we did research looking at different insurance company coverage policies, and some just say a definite diagnosis of ALS. Some use what are called the Escorial criteria that came from a published paper, work out of a hospital-led group in Spain. And this is tricky because there's no one consensus in the field, as far as I'm aware of exactly how you decide whether someone has ALS or not. There are probable cases, definite cases. So is there a problem if insurers are using the Escorial criteria, for instance? Rick?
Steve, those criteria should never be used when making clinical decisions about patients. They were never designed for that. They were designed to stratify how much ALS is in the drug-treated patient group in a trial versus the placebo-treated group in a trial. Although the terms definite, probable, and possible apply uncertainty, the reality is by the time you even start rolling out the Ellis-Correal criteria, you've decided the patient has ALS. It's not about how certain you are, it's about how many body parts are affected. And there is no really good clinical or scientific reason to restrict a medication to people with one Ellis-Correal criteria. It makes no sense.
Well, as I read it, it doesn't sound as starkly bad like that. I'm reading one version where it says, patients have been diagnosed with ALS on the basis of the presence of evidence of motor neuron degeneration by clinical EP or neuropathologic examination and or upper motor neuron and progressive spread of symptoms, and the absence of EP or other evidence of a different disease and neuroimaging evidence of other disease processes and ... So if you read it that way, does that still sound too narrow?
Well, Steve, I thought I heard you say that there were some companies that were restricting the use of it to people with Ellis-Correal definite ALS or probable ALS. And I thought I actually heard.
I think one insurer that I saw
Say the same
does
thing.
say, one insurer does, I'm looking at definite or probable. I could have
Doesn't
sworn I
make
saw
sense.
one that said definite. So I
That
guess
doesn't make sense.
what I'm hearing is that you do not think that using the term definite as it is defined by the Ellis-Correal is an appropriate way to identify patients with ALS.
Or even probable.
It's
I mean,
absurd. It's
yeah.
absurd, Steve.
And that's what I was saying about education. And
Right.
that's exactly what I had heard from one individual was, if they're possible, that means they don't have ALS. If they're probable, and you have to educate and explain. And I think both Dr. Lewis and Dr. Badalak have good points. They should never be used in any type of anything outside of clinical trials.
So what's the best way for an insurer who needs to write a policy to be available to the individual solo practicing neurologist who might be prescribing this drug? How do they make sure that the doctor's not prescribing this drug for people who have, I'm not sure what it would be, myasthenia gravis or something else?
I mean, the neurologist is board certified to take care of patients with neurological disease, and you can't second guess their diagnosis. If they feel strong enough that that's a diagnosis and are willing to not search for other diagnoses, there has to be a level of professional trust for that for that physician with their patient. I just don't think that they can put, many patients that have ALS die before they even have probable ALS because they have prominent lower motor neuron features that attack the bulbar musculature, and then unfortunately they pass away. So you can't use any of this criteria. It's just got to be some level of trust.
Does the
Steve, there
double
should
A,
just be
does the
one
double A,
box.
go ahead.
The PA should just be one box. Does this patient have ALS? Yes. Fax it in, approved, treated. That should be it.
All right, we'll ask our insurance folks about how that might work. AAN does or does not have in its clinical guidelines a clear definition of how to diagnose ALS that payers could cut and paste into their policies. They don't, right?
I mean, it's irrelevant. I mean, people are not running around with diagnoses of ALS that are inaccurate. The diagnosis of ALS, when it's made by a neurologist, is almost always correct. The problem is on the opposite end, as you've heard from several different speakers, it takes forever for somebody to figure out that they have it. And so delaying this anymore because an insurance company is questioning a doctor, did you really make the diagnosis of ALS the correct way? People aren't just running around with that as a false positive diagnosis.
Okay. Michelle and Emily, how would you react to the way that payers would usually, or in this case, should identify what the diagnosis criteria are? Because we know there is a lot of variety today in how this is being done. So I'm curious what your perspectives on it are.
Yeah, I mean, to just echo what you said, I mean, a lot of the policies that we've seen with Radicava do have that diagnosis of definite or probable. And the question is, in AMX, the AMX trial, they had to have a diagnosis of definite. So it meant, you know, a narrower population. So I guess from a payer's perspective, how do they identify the patients that would benefit from this therapy? Or, you know, so they're looking to those criteria within the trial because it's such limited data at the time of launch. So I think payers do tend to look at those, and I hear what everyone's saying on, you know, on this forum, that's probably not practical, but from a payer's perspective, they're just trying to figure out, you know, what patient population might benefit most from this therapy, and they tend to use that diagnosis from the clinical trial. And like you said, you're Radicava, we're seeing that definite or probable in a lot of policies.
Yeah. Just from a structural, again, from a procedural, I guess, perspective, and this gets back to, you know, to Steve's comment about education to a certain extent, but insurers are never going to be the expert on every single condition for which they have to create policies for treatments. And they very often have to rely on clinical guidelines and the FDA label. And the FDA label includes the eligibility criteria from the studies. And so especially brand new drugs, especially very expensive ones, but even when they're not that expensive, the default almost is to cut and paste from one of those two kind of sources, clinical guidelines, the FDA label / clinical eligibility criteria. So that's one of the reasons why we talk about it, because there's often a tension, as Rick just said, between the criteria that you would use to, in a sense, enhance the likelihood that you're going to have a clinical trial population that can show a benefit because of the rate of progression or the certainty of their diagnosis, and the desire of clinicians and patients certainly to use it in a broader population. So I doubt honestly, we're going to see insurance policies where they say ALS, yes or no, you're ready to go. But we're going to walk through some of the other inclusion criteria in the clinical trials, because I think there are some in there that are going to be particular sticking points with clinicians in the patient community. Kathy?
On that topic of, you know, using the inclusion criteria to make payer decisions, those inclusion criteria, in the number of years I've been watching clinical trials, and especially with the Radicava figuring out that the fast progressor group gave them better results, those inclusion criteria are as much about picking the placebo group as they are picking the treatment group.
Mm-hmm.
So they want a placebo group that doesn't overachieve.
Right.
And should we be making decisions on covering a drug based on that? I don't think so.
The counter argument philosophically is that that's the only population in which you have evidence that there's a benefit, marginal or otherwise. And that's always that is the philosophical argument. I'm not claiming it has value in this situation, but that's why we talk about it. So let me move to some of the inclusion criteria, because there might be certain ones that you think, well, that's fine, that really wouldn't create a problem, whereas others are going to be a big sticking point. So again, if you look at the eligibility criteria, male or female, obviously 18 to 80, diagnosed with sporadic or familial ALS. So realize that a health plan cutting and pasting from the eligibility criteria will have that in there, familial or sporadic ALS. Here are the two that I really kind of wanted to get your comments on. One is less than or equal to 18 months since ALS symptom onset. That's a criterion for that trial that plans might pick up in their insurance coverage. The next one's going to be vital capacity, slow vital capacity greater than 60%. So you may see insurance coverage policies that are going to limit to that population. Clinical experts, can you weigh in on your view of the clinical appropriateness of limiting coverage to those criteria? 18 months since symptom onset and SVC greater than 60%.
Inappropriate.
I
Aaron?
agree. Yeah, no, I agree. You can't, this is real world medicine. It's not confined to trials. So we can't just use this strict criteria. It's not fair.
Say why it might. Is there any clinical reason that a patient has had ALS for 3 years, 5 years? Is there any reason to think that the trajectory of their condition is such that the treatment benefit is going to be of question at that stage because they're just so different than the patients who were in the trials? Or does that just not make sense?
Steve, I would argue something that I argued earlier. Those inclusion criteria were selected to give the investigators the best chance of seeing a signal in the trial. They were not selected because they thought only these patients would benefit from the drug. I would argue that a drug that slows progression by 25% gives even more benefit to a very slow progressor who's expected to live 10 years than it does for a fast progressor who's expected to live 2. So it's absurd to me that an insurance company would exclude people who are outside the inclusion-exclusion criteria. We never do that with Riluzole.
Right. I think you're probably aware, though, that this is standard practice for how insurance is based upon the clinical trials of brand new drugs. Now, not every FDA label mirrors those criteria, obviously, and not every insurance policy does either. But this is a relatively standard approach, again, for using the evidence to support a coverage policy when they are not clinical experts, and they may not have that same insight that you have, for instance, that there isn't any reason to think that the pathophysiology of the condition, if it's a 5-year survival curve, 5-year into symptoms versus 18 months, they may not have any insight into whether that does or doesn't mean that the patients are very different. So that's the tension that this is all set up around. I'm going to talk about tracheostomy in a second. So I have a feeling I know where you're going to go on that one, but be prepared to say whether patients who are trached should have access to this or not. Kathy?
I think that the 18-month rule is a lot about they don't want people to die during their trial.
Mm-hmm.
So if you don't want people to die during the trial, you want to get them earlier on. That's not to say that people who've had ALS longer wouldn't benefit from the drug. That's not to say that at all. It's just we're trying to pick people who aren't going to die during our very expensive clinical trial.
Yeah. Spinal muscular atrophy is an interesting condition in which there are big issues around different subtypes. And so just those neurologists, they may think I'm overcalling this, but you can imagine that's where some of the issues around, how old they are when you start treatment became a big issue, still is. And so this is going to come up, I think, here too. Joel, go ahead.
By definition, the number of people in the slow progressing group is growing. I've had ALS 6 years, and so to select the short duration patients as the one eligible seems highly unfair. And there again, like Dr. Bedlake and Lewis said, there's no reason to believe that I wouldn't benefit even longer for a longer time with access to a drug that slows my progression even more.
Okay. Emily or Michelle, bouncing back to you, any perspectives again on this general tension that I've been framing and your anticipation of how you think payers will and should respond in this context to using the clinical trial eligibility criteria as a part of their insurance coverage criteria?
I just wanted to make the comment that, payers they're pressured by not only the rising drug prices, but having very limited data at the time of launch. So it's really hard from a payer's perspective, who is the right patient, at the right time. And so we're seeing not only, in this category, but we're starting to see payers use criteria from the clinical trials in other diseases that we hadn't seen before. So like in oncology and rare disease, because that's one way that they can limit costs is to restrict that population. So we're seeing it in a broader, in rare disease, like I said, that we haven't seen before, because there's just, where they're trying to figure out that population that would benefit most. And it's really tricky. And as everyone has mentioned, it's just really hard from a payer's perspective to understand who would benefit most.
So the purpose of our final report in some ways is to shed some light on these tensions and these perspectives. So this is a very, very rich conversation. Emily, your perspective on this, having framed the coverage criteria, maybe not personally, but at Primera, the coverage criteria that you've got for Radicava, and thinking forward, do you think in the short term you're likely to cut and paste these clinical trial eligibility criteria? Is that the general approach that you would take?
Well, I think, Steve, you know, we are taking this back to our P&T committee later this month. And I think in general, P&T committees tend to be more conservative when a new high-cost treatment comes out for a specific disease. But I think that, you know, it's been a number of years since IV edaravone was first available in the US. And so I think that there's more comfort potentially within our committee for looking at the criteria differently. But I would also highlight potentially an opportunity for payers with both of these products because they are oral. With the medical benefit prior authorization, there's not a lot of what I'll call wiggle room in terms of making it operationally easier. But I think on the pharmacy benefit, for a number of reasons, there's a lot more opportunity to make it easier to go through the prior authorization process. For example, what's sometimes called an automated prior authorization on the pharmacy benefit, where, you know, if you go to a website and you answer the questions and you answer them in the way that the payer thinks is appropriate, PA just automatically approves, and then you can fill it. And so I think that with these two oral products, there's potentially an opportunity to expedite where there may not have been for IV edaravone.
Okay. Aaron, I apologize. I'm now sensitive again. I'm trying to make sure I have enough time to get through to questions around pricing and FDA and others. So real quickly though, tracheostomy is on the list. So just to get people's very quick, same situation from your guys' perspectives, Aaron and Rick. Tracheostomy shouldn't be an exclusion criterion for coverage? Or is it reasonable to say that if they've already reached that stage, they won't, they're different enough that they might not benefit?
Steve, when you say that stage, I mean, are you aware that just because someone has a tracheostomy, they could look completely different from each other? There are people with tracheostomies who still walk and use their hands
or live
normally.
40 years, I know, or live 40 years, Stephen Hawking, etc. I know.
So no, I mean, I just think this cookie cutter approach is absurd. I don't understand why insurance companies don't reach out to experts to help us or help them craft policies that actually make sense based on the science.
Well, that is part of what we are trying to facilitate as part of what we do too. But I hear what you're saying. Aaron, I know you've had your hand up now for long enough. I'll let you go ahead.
I was just going to say that I know it's contrary to the way that this approval process works for these new drugs that come out, but I would like to see the insurance companies take a more broad approval approach and then narrow it down as the data, may dictate. I mean, there are some open label extensions that suggest that people with later disease can get effect, but that's not a new trial. So if they started with narrow approval criteria for these in these medications, what would it actually take for them to broaden their coverage? Would it be adequate to see more data from an open label extension, or does it have to be a new phase 3 trial that's done from scratch? For a disease as fatal quickly as ALS, I'd like to see them take a less conservative approach and be more broad in their approval, and then as the data pairs out going forward, they can be pared down.
All right. Great. Let me try to move quickly through a couple of these other issues, because then there are a couple of distinctive ones around oral edaravone as well. So the continuation discontinuation issue. Most standard policies are set up to approve a new drug like this for 6 months, and then there's some attestation from a clinician or medical record submission saying that the patient is gaining some benefit. Now, somebody said at some point people misunderstood how ALS works, and they were expecting people to get better on treatment as opposed to slowing their decline. Basically, I'm reading just from one policy. It says at 6 months, the patient, chart notes have to demonstrate that the patient continues to show a positive clinical response as documented by the ability to perform most activities of daily living. So that's the idea again, that if they reach a certain stage at which they're not able to do that, that the idea of improving their functional status may not have the same kind of clinical rationale. Do you see a problem? What would you advise around that kind of approach to seeking attestation of benefit? Kathy?
I think all the trials that we've talked about, what they've measured is in real life, are you getting worse less quickly than you would have been getting worse without the drug?
Mhm.
And that's hard. That's when you're taking the drug, that's hard to measure. My experience is mom took Riluzole. There were days it's like, do you think this is really helping? Well, it's not hurting. You keep taking it. But it's hard to know. But I think that as long as it's not causing problems, I think people should have access to them.
Okay, Aaron?
I mean, in a perfect world, we have a lead in where you have a patient who you've followed and have ALS FRS scores for the past 6 months, and then you initiate the new therapy and you see, is the rate of decline better? That's really hard to see, as we've seen with these trials just showing a 2-point improvement. You mentioned SMA, so spinal muscular atrophy, a disease which for adults is lifelong, and to see that trajectory decline is very, very hard to see. So I don't think it's a good way to do it. I think obviously, if you can see any kind of plateauing of decline, that is a huge victory, and so that would be adequate for me for a 6-month reapproval process to just see that the disease is not, continuing its rapid descent.
Rick?
I mean, once again, we see that the insurance companies understand almost nothing about this disease. The progression of a patient's ALS is not linear throughout the course of their disease. We talked about this earlier. It can be linear over short periods of time, but I mean, there can be plateaus where they don't progress at all. There can be periods where they progress a lot. There can be periods where they actually recover a little bit of function, usually for a short period of time. So, I mean, if you have to have a 6-month criteria, what it should be is very vague. It should say, patient and neurologist have met and decided together that this is worth continuing, and that's it.
Okay, Joel?
Yeah, I cannot see my neurologist being able to say definitively in his chart note that my course has leveled off or improved because of the drug. I think that there really shouldn't be language in the 6-month reapproval that calls upon the neurologist to point to some measurement they've seen in the office. I think I would agree with Dr. Bedlack, a global assessment by the doctor and the patient about whether it's been helpful or may be helpful to continue really should be enough.
Thank you. Got it. Okay. I'm now going to swing over to edaravone and ask one question, because all of these questions I've asked are actually equally applicable to oral edaravone in a way. Again, although plans already have their IV edaravone coverage policy, and they'll probably just shop that over into the oral one. I'm sure, Steve, you guys have been thinking about that. The one big difference I wanted to ask about was the dosing. Because there's kind of a complicated dosing schedule that was part of the clinical trial.
It's been part of the clinical trial since the very beginning,
right,
with the cyclic dosage. Yeah.
And so the question from an insurance perspective is, do you think insurers should cut and paste that dosing schedule into their coverage to kind of identify what is covered as far as the amount and the dosing? Or does this need to be left ad lib to the doctor? And if so, are there any risks of mistreatment, overtreatment with oral Radicava?
Well, the first thing I can tell you is it's going to be what's studied in the clinical trial, which is the cyclic dosing. That's what is in our FDA label. That is what we have to recommend. But that's not where we're stopping. Part of our post-marketing commitment to the FDA is looking at daily dosing versus cyclic dosing, and hopefully those results will be coming out in a couple of years so that we can guide. And we have to, as a manufacturer, be guided by the FDA and put that in our label to assist physicians on how they're going to treat the patient. But ultimately, we always leave it up to the decision between the patient and the physician and the clinician's experience.
Right. Now, Emily, I forget if you guys have taken on your formal policy yet on oral edaravone, but has this question come up around how you're going to script the element of the dosing?
Yeah, Steve, so our policy is posted. We do not have a limit on quantity for the oral or the IV. And, part of the reason for that is that we really haven't seen in what we'll call inappropriate use of the IV. And so we're thinking that it will extend to the oral as well.
Okay. I'm going to take that. I think we can work that into what we would want to say about that element. Okay. Are you ready to take another shift in focus here on this roller coaster? We're going to turn towards issues of pricing and value now. So, and Steve, you get to stay. I know that your partners in this area in terms of life science companies chose to opt out as they felt that this close to their second FDA AdCom, they had originally wanted to be part of this group, but they felt late in the game that they needed to opt out. So you are going to get some of these questions when in a sense they're kind of reflecting the field. First though, specifically for oral edaravone, why is the oral dosing, why is the cost, I should say, of the oral version the same as the IV cost? Should it be reflected more because it's higher value to patients, or much lower because suddenly you're going to have a lot more patients using your treatment because of the ease of accessibility? Shouldn't the price come down would be one way to think of it.
So here's my answer to this. Unfortunately, I know that these pricing models are very complex. Not being part of that discussion, I'm not the appropriate person to answer that, being part of the medical affairs department, but I'm more than happy to take that back to the people at MTPA who are appropriate to answer it and make sure they follow up with you after this meeting.
Okay. We've recommended in other circumstances that life science companies recognize that if something comes up and the use of their drug is likely to suddenly accelerate from, let's say, an ultra rare to a much more numerous population, that there's kind of a general sense that they should moderate the price, given that they're going to be, not always, because we believe in the value. And if there's a lot more value, then that's another argument, but something to consider. And I know you weren't part of the decision-making process around the 171,000 for the IV dose at the very, very beginning. Do you have any sense of whether value, cost effectiveness was considered, or was it really market forces? Can you make any comment on how it was arrived?
Yeah, unfortunately, I can't, because I wasn't involved in those decisions. I know that they're not done arbitrarily, and there's a lot of factors that go into it, as you said. But not having been part of those discussions, I really can't weigh in on that.
Okay. Kathy.
So Steve has probably heard, I've been a critic of the Radicava pricing 5 years ago. I thought it was just way overpriced. People with ALS had been getting it. It's an old stroke drug from Japan. They've been getting it from Japan for around $30,000 a year. And it was obviously a successful product for them in Japan at $30,000 a year. Gets approval in the US for ALS, and all of a sudden the price goes up 5 times, which was remarkably similar to the Part B copay for it, $30,000. So it was like, what a coincidence. But I just think that if we had the serious pricing discussions 5 years ago that we're having today, we would be on a whole different plane. So thank you.
No, thank you.
And so again, AMX is not here, but we've already raised in an earlier press release an idea that has come up many times associated with drugs around which there's significant uncertainty. So this question is open for anybody on the panel, but one model to consider would be that in a situation for AMX, let's assume it gets approved by the FDA. I think many people at least would still acknowledge that there's some significant uncertainty about its benefits. And we have the second trial that's kind of ticking and en route. But one pricing approach would be to say that in that context of uncertainty, to price it with an uncertainty kind of discount, you could call it, closer to the price of production, enough to keep people in business and the lights on, But while we're waiting for more definitive information about the true magnitude of the benefit, that it's not a full market price, if you will, that's launched into the market. And I wonder if anybody has a comment on that, on whether they think that that would be an appropriate way to start to think about pricing for new agents in ALS and other areas, or whether there would be some downsides that should be weighed as well. And I know none of you may feel like you're price, cost, value experts, but the gestalt, certainly from the payer community, has often been, why is there no seeming nickel off the price, even when we have so much less evidence than we would want and will have relatively soon? Isn't there some relationship to the level of certainty that can be reflected in the price? Joel, what do you
I
think?
was early this week speaking with someone I know who has ALS. He's a lot further along than I am, and I asked him almost a similar question to what you posed. If a new drug came out and it was going to cost you 150,000, at the stage you're at, would you consider taking? And he said no, but if it was much less expensive early on, he would definitely take that chance and take it. I believe a lot of patients who see their lifespan as already short will be reluctant to go into a situation where there's a lot of uncertainty about what it will do for them and their families financially. So I think something akin to a proposal I saw you wrote related to the accelerated approval pathway, a marginal cost structure early on in the availability of a drug may be something to think about in the same setting you're talking about.
One tricky aspect that I do know, and this is a good example of that, is that let's say there's already one existing drug out there at a certain price point. So are we going to apply this new uncertainty discount just to the brand new drug, or does it somehow have to now live in dynamic equilibrium in some way with the other drug? But just as we were talking before about the likelihood that patients will be seeking treatment with all these drugs at the same time, 170 plus 170 plus whatever riluzole is, that's pretty hefty for everybody, patients, families, the health system. And so and actually in Europe, they're now experimenting with ways for patients who are on multiple expensive drugs to have the drug companies work through a kind of blind negotiator to reduce their prices together to get to a point of a fair value. Whereas each company has to give up some to kind of get the combination down to a level that the health system in Europe feels is affordable. We have nothing like that here in the US, not even close around launch pricing. But it's an interesting, because this is a problem that health systems around the world are facing, people wanting to take multiple drugs at $100,000 to $200,000, and it pretty quickly stacks up. So I think we have to develop some really new tools in our policy toolkit to try to figure out how to deal with these problems. Aaron?
I definitely won't profess to be an expert in this region, but I think about as a corollary, the drug for dementia for Alzheimer's, aducanumab, which was out initially, and they were pricing it at, $50,000, and then there were some problems with it, patients having side effects, and also the effectiveness was brought into question by the FDA, and they cut the price in half. They just, okay, we'll give it to you half off, and as a way to try to get more patients. So, and while they were sent back to do more trials. So if you have a drug that's not really clear if it has benefit, in that case, it was a drug that may have some detriment, the price coming down only makes sense. So taking for that model, I would like to see that effort being taken for this drugs.
Okay, thank you. Kathy again, yes.
I would like to see these drugs, oral Radicava and AMX-035, priced in such a way that payers can let people with ALS have them both. And I don't know what the answer is. I don't know what the right price is, but I think that I want physicians to be able to prescribe them, and I want people with ALS to be able to get both of them if they want to take them in addition to riluzole. I think they should have the options, and I think price is going to be an issue.
Thank you. Okay. Without AMX here at the table, I'm not sure there's too much more I have to ask about the pricing, but please feel free to circle back to it if it connects with something else. And, you know, to a certain extent, we're not here to pass judgment on the FDA's prior AdCom or what they're going to be doing in a couple of weeks. But if we think just generically about this situation, it really creates some interesting dilemmas, because accelerate, you know, as you guys know, people have been talking about, will FDA approve it under the regular kind of approval pathway or accelerated approval? But accelerated approval requires a biomarker that they're using, that they will be kind of studying its confirmation later. Here, there's really the neurofilament biomarker cannot really be the standard on which this would be approved. It's kind of just one study of the clinical outcomes. And FDA doesn't really have a pathway that looks like that. Low or no safety, promising single study, they don't have that separate pathway at the FDA. So the ALS Association and lots of other people are saying that's just that this is a situation in which the regular pathway should work. Despite it being one study, the FDA itself kind of told the company you can go ahead with one study. Any comments on a general policy approach, lessons to be learned from where we are today with AMX, assuming that we're going to be coming into these kinds of situations, whether it's an ALS or other serious conditions downstream? How would you like to see FDA handle this kind of situation? Kathy, do you have your hand up again for this one? Okay, good, please.
So a couple things with accelerated approval. There are some advocates who've been trying to figure out meaningful clinical benefit, and if there is a way to thread that needle without a proven surrogate endpoint biomarker. So I don't know. I've seen people try to read it that way, but I don't know if the FDA can actually do that. There are proposals for conditional approvals, and the people who oppose the idea of conditional approval legislation typically are people who say the confirmatory studies for accelerated approval are never done. We don't need a provisional approval that's just going to make that the same or worse. So I think the best thing we can do is figure out, is there a way to thread the accelerated approval needle? I don't know if there is. And then if not, we need some way that we can get drugs approved with confirmatory studies that have teeth in them.
Okay, Rick?
Yeah, I mean, I think, as I've been saying all day, Steve, you have to look at the whole picture. First, you have to look at the unmet need. Second, you have to look at how difficult it is to do trials in that disease space. You know, in ALS, I would argue we need to broaden our mindset about what we call a biomarker. I mean, I think of a biomarker as a surrogate for the number of motor neurons that a person has. We have no way to measure that. And therefore, the clinical measures that we have are surrogates for the number of motor neurons that someone has and could be considered biomarkers, even though they're not a blood test or a spinal fluid test or an EMG test or an MRI. They are measurements that we make. Mm-hmm. And I feel like, you know, given all that I just said, if you have a clinical trial that's well done, that shows clinically meaningful changes in multiple outcome measures, you should go ahead with accelerated approval. This is a perfect situation because they're going to finish that second trial no matter what. So it's not a situation where if you approve this, you remove all incentive. We don't want that. So, I mean, I think this is the perfect opportunity for the FDA to step up and show people with ALS that they care, and that, you know, they're going to remain true to their ALS clinical research guidelines that they put out a few years ago.
I was going to talk about that in a second too, if we have time. One question though about, well, I don't want to get too into the weeds on what a surrogate outcome can be or can't be. And FDA is obviously sensitive to this issue after what happened with aducanumab. But I do have a question about the Phoenix study, the ongoing phase 3. So one concern in the research community is that the second that the drug becomes FDA approved, every person in that study who thinks that, gee, I might be on placebo, I'm gonna go get the real thing now. Why would I take, I've got a limited time to live. Why would I take any risk that I'm on placebo here? I'm out. And the whole study falls apart like that. What's going to keep that from happening? Rick, do you think it's likely? I somehow think that that's going to happen.
I actually don't. I don't think that's likely to happen. I think, first of all, many of the people in that study are from outside the United States where the drug is not readily available. They would have had the opportunity to construct it themselves, as we've talked about earlier, by buying the supplement TUDCA and getting a prescription for sodium phenylbutyrate, and they opted not to do that. And I would also say that many of the patients that I see in clinical trials, they understand the importance of completing the trial and helping the field to move forward. I think they're incredibly highly motivated people that participate in these trials. So I don't think the trial is going to fall apart.
Okay. Kathy?
I think if Amylex were here, they'd say they're going to fill that trial with Europe.
I'm sorry, say again?
They're going to fill that trial from Europe.
From Europe. Yeah, again, we don't have AMX here to answer that question, unfortunately, but I'm sure that they're thinking about it because they wouldn't want the trial to fall apart. I don't think anybody would want that to happen. But it does raise some interesting even equity issues of performing our confirmatory trials ex-US after we approve them here. The other thing I wanted to get a couple of comments on were, Rick, I think you raised the issue earlier. I'm not sure we have that much to add at ICER, but we are aware, obviously, that the FDA has this ALS science strategy that is kind of, it come out with about 4 years after the original act. What was the act called? It was called the FDA has an action plan for rare neurodegenerative diseases, and it is in accordance with the provisions of the Accelerating Access to Critical Therapies for ALS Act, or Act for ALS. That was signed, I guess, just 2 years ago, just a year and a half. So, or less, I'm sorry, less than a year ago. So what I'd like to see is if you guys have any thoughts on some of the language that I'm reading about what this science strategy is, sounds very high level. Facilitate patient access to new drugs whenever possible. Not really sure how the FDA is supposed to do that. Promote greater participation in clinical trials by reducing barriers. Utilize digital health technologies. I'm not going to read the whole thing. There's all this business about biomarkers. Aaron, what you were saying, it's right there, right? Improved characterization of disease pathogenesis and natural history, quantifying disease progression, create new biomarkers, et cetera. So is there anything that you would like to pluck out from those laundry lists to say, here's what this should look like on the ground, and it's near-term achievable, and we should really be helping the FDA and others say, among this long list of things that you're hoping to accomplish, go here, go fast. Kathy, and then Rick.
I think that the action plan, the new action plan, was spurred on directly from Act for ALS, which is very specific legislation to bring in a few things, many things related to expanded access and NIH working together. So it's a very specialized action plan as far as I'm concerned. A more pertinent document is the FDA guidance for industry for ALS drug development, or I don't know that that's the exact name, but the guidance document, which is several years old, has things that I think are extremely important, speaking to flexibility. And that the guidance document, I think, is much more pertinent to the discussion here. Thank you.
Okay. Rick, and then Aaron.
Totally agree with Kathy as usual. And I would say, the FDA in the last few years has really put itself out there and says, it hears about this tremendous unmet need in our community, and it's willing to be more flexible and more creative in order to get experimental drugs, into the hands of more people with ALS. And so now they've got an opportunity to do it. I hope next month we see them in action doing it.
Rick, how would you feel? I'm going to go ahead and throw a what if to you before I go to Aaron. If someone could wave a magic wand and say, FDA, you're going to have the power to be much more flexible, et cetera, just the way you've claimed you should be, serious unmet need. And the drugs will come out at a cost plus pricing basis for the time it takes to get better evidence on them. Do you think that would advance the cause of innovation, advance FDA's willingness or larger ability? They don't think about cost, right? But Do you think if that were paired somehow, that it would be a good thing for the field, or you think it's really important for the FDA to stay away from thinking about the cost aspect?
You know, it's so tough. I mean, I'm not a cost expert by any means, but one of the things that I worry about when you start talking about imposing limits on what people can charge for the first few years of a new drug is pushing drug companies to other fields. I mean, it's been so hard to get companies interested in working in ALS. For a long time, this was just considered the desert of neurology. Nobody wanted to do trials. And, you know, with the approval of Radicava, and now, you know, with a positive trial for AMX 0035 and maybe one for tofersen, we've got more companies interested in ALS than we've ever had. The last thing that I want to do is create some sort of disincentive and make people start looking in other fields because they think that that's going to be more profitable for them.
Right. Well, I would certainly stipulate that this has to be done on, well, I wouldn't say it can't be targeted. It can't be one area, but not another, because that would, as you say, it would just shift people away from certain innovative areas. Aaron, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just thinking of the same things you're talking about, that, you know, in the world of genetic ALS, there's a lot of interesting things going on. And I think getting a hold on genetic ALS better treatment is going to open the door for sporadic ALS treatment. And, you know, we were 30 years, 20 years with only just one drug, and now all of a sudden we got two. And I think there is a real takeoff here. I want to point out the real need to make enrollment in clinical trials more accessible to patients everywhere. And that's a huge problem. I think, you know, even I'm in the Bay Area, there's all kinds of research all over, and it's hard to get people enrolled sometimes. And so, you know, partnering and getting the FDA to help, you know, and we have organizations like the ALS Association, which help to get patients connected with clinicians that are doing research. Super, super important.
Good. So I will actually highlight that because it connects with our equity discussion earlier, and somebody brought it up, but you know, digital, the ability to gather the outcomes from a clinical trial at home through digital kind of technologies has the opportunity to really expand the clinical trial population in ways that could help address equity. So that and more decentralized trial designs in general, I think, are going to be things that the FDA, I know they'll be very interested in moving that forward pretty quickly. Kathy?
Back to your question about the FDA and price, I think that FDA has its hands full dealing with safety and efficacy, and I really don't want them personally dealing with price.
Okay. Good. All right. I am going to ask one question about the research agenda, because we've had good conversations with some of you already, and certainly with the manufacturers. We have a pretty good idea of some of the things that we think can be highlighted. But I do want to ask one thing about the outcome measures that we've got, this outcome scale. I don't know a single clinical field that's really thrilled with its functional outcome measure. I just don't. Nobody feels like it captures everything. It's either too sensitive or too specific. It's not precise enough, or it's too precise. These are hard to create, especially operational ones that you can actually administer in a clinical trial. So where are we on the arc of innovation when it comes to the clinical outcome measures in ALS? Do we need a lot more effort there? Do we need the ALS Association to invest a lot of money in research just to develop better outcome measures? Are we happy with with the functional scales that we've got? So we really don't need to do too much more there. What do you think? And Steve, this could involve you too, from the kind of the clinical life science company side. But I want to get a sense from you all about whether there's a lot more work to be done there, and if so, what's the best next step? Rick.
So Steve, I don't think anybody's thrilled with the ALS FRSR score. I think we recognize that it lacks sensitivity, it lacks specificity as far as, you know, telling us about motor neuron loss. I mean, there's questions on there that get worse in an hour if somebody starts using a non-invasive ventilator, or, you know, get dramatically better in an hour if somebody starts using a medication that dries up their secretion. So it's by no means perfect. It's what we have for now. It has resulted in one drug approval, so it's not absolutely terrible. But there's a pretty major effort underway in the field to develop, you know, more biomarkers. So the NIH CREATE Consortium has been a major player in this. The Northeast ALS Consortium has been a major player in this. And, you know, different kinds of biomarkers. I mean, I think biomarkers that tell us about, you know, surrogates for motor neuron loss. I actually think CSF neurofilament could very well be one of those. blood neurofilament as measured by the AMX 0035 folks didn't seem like it did much. But if you look at that tofersen study, it's pretty amazing what happened. And, if you look at the natural history of people with SOD1 mutations, I mean, Dr. Benatar has been able to show that neurofilament levels just explode, within a few months of when they start having clinical symptoms of ALS. So he's been studying people with pre-symptomatic ALS. So I think that biomarker tells us a lot about rate of progression, when the disease starts, possibly a surrogate for the number of motor neurons. And there's going to be better ones. There's going to be pharmacodynamic markers that tell us which patients might be optimal candidates for different therapies. Like there's one out there that looks at activated microglia. It's a PET ligand that's only picked up by activated microglia. So a company that might be developing something that blocks the activation of microglia, hey, that could be something that allows us to select which patients to put in the trial. We don't want people that don't have activated microglia in the trial, but also a way to figure out maybe in just a few weeks if we're on the right track with that drug. So I think things are happening. I think in the next few years, we're going to have much better biomarkers.
Good. I hope so. Biomarkers, I mean, interestingly, again, kind of like Alzheimer's, biomarkers to some extent can only be as good as your ultimate outcome measure against which you're going to validate them. So it's not like you can focus on one without the other. So to the extent that the ALS FSR is not viewed as ready for prime time yet, or it's being used, but if it can be improved in some way, I think it sounds like there's still more work to be done there, because every biomarker is going to be used to kind of triage people and then see how they do on that as the major outcome, and mortality, obviously. So, but I completely agree that the opportunity to have biomarkers that will help identify patients with these different progression kind of natural histories and different reaction, different response to drugs is going to be critical to the field moving forward. Kathy, you're going to get the last word before we move into everybody getting the last word.
Okay, thank you. ALS FRSR, there is work going on to try to, given what we have, how do we make it better? How do we make it more dependable? How do we make it more consistently measured? So that's going on, which is good. There are also other measures that people are considering. And then there's the whole biomarker thing. But I think the thing we have to realize is that ALS FRSR is what the FDA wants right now. And it's and if we want to use another endpoint, or we want to use a biomarker, we're going to have to show that it tracks to this clunky ALS FRSR. So I think we have a challenge in front of us.
You are exactly right. And my only plea is that as they continue down that kind of clunky path, that they remember that it is really helpful for patients, for clinicians, and for everybody to have outcome measures that you can track across different treatments that are going to be available to people, because otherwise trying to do indirect comparisons gets very, very difficult. Okay, so I do want to thank you all. This is incredibly rich, and I'm sorry we didn't have a chance to cover everything. I'd like each of you, though, to get a chance to make a final comment before we turn back to the CEPAC. The way we frame this is we ask people in one sentence, a comma is allowed, a carefully placed semicolon is in the gray zone, but if you can keep it to one sentence, and it would either be the message that you think just has to be hammered home, a theme that you really want to see emphasized, even if it's been said before, it can be something that just slipped out and didn't get talked about enough and you want to name it now. I also encourage people to think of a request. If you had a request of one stakeholder in the ecosystem here, and it can be anybody from funders of research to insurers to clinical societies, anybody, what would that request be to make the world a better place for patients, for innovation, and for ultimately for affordability? So think of that as you will. I'd like to let the patients go last. So Steve, let me start with you if you don't mind.
Let me come off mute. So Mitsubishi Tanabe Pharma, we're committed to the ALS community. We have a lot of research that's going on right now. We have our 96-week extension, and we have our AO2 cyclic versus daily dosing. We also have the large biomarker study. So my ask is partnering with the patients as we move forward, not just in the design of these clinical trials, but enrollment of these clinical trials, because they're so important for us, not just as one company, but as a community. to really understand, as Dr. Badlack pointed out, these different surrogates. And so that's important to us. And finally, I want to just say that the company is, and I'm honored to serve this community.
Thank you very much. All right. Michelle.
So, just to reiterate a lot of the comments here, this is a really complicated disease. It's devastating, and it's really hard, I think, for payers to know, what's that balance of providing access, yet the cost of these therapies are so high. So, to maybe for payers to come together with a broader community of how we can tackle these and make policies that make sense for everybody, to control costs, but yet provide access to the patients that need these therapies and deserve these therapies. I think there's a disconnect, obviously, between the provider community and payers on what makes sense. But at the same time, payers are pressured by these high costs. So somewhere to meet in the middle, especially these, diseases where there's not a lot of therapies. It's a complex patient population, yet the drugs are very high in cost.
Okay, great. Thank you. Emily?
I just wanted to sincerely thank the patients and the patient advocates for their stories and their experiences today. And I guess I would just encourage payers to prioritize timely implementation of coverage decisions for treatments with ALS.
Good. Thank you very much. All right, I'm going to turn to Aaron.
Okay, I would just say I'm firmly an advocate for easier access to these drugs and other pipeline treatments for ALS at affordable costs, so that the patients and their doctors can make the best unhindered decision for the patient's behalf, for the patient's behalf.
Thank you. Rick?
Yeah, thanks, Steve. I would just say, this is the most brutal disease I've seen as a physician. I still feel like we have very limited treatment options. I feel like access to these treatment options is already too limited, and research to develop new treatment options is incredibly difficult, given the heterogeneity, given the lack of good measurement tools. And I just wish that regulators would remember all this, lower their bar a little bit for approving therapies in this space. And I wish that payers would remember it and try to make these new therapies as accessible to patients as possible.
Okay, thank you very much. Joel?
Having been on the prescribing and now on the receiving end, I would urge payers and the regulators to work to give as many options as possible for the doctor, so that in the exam room, they can do what they have taken an oath to do with their patients, to do as much as they can for them and serve them the best they can.
Thank you very much, Joel. Kathy? Last again.
Thank you. I've heard pleas to regulators and payers, and I agree with those. We want these therapies. I want these therapies to be available to everybody with ALS. But I also make a plea to the manufacturers that we have to have a price value arrangement that works for healthcare in general, because we have problems with healthcare costs in this country, and we can't just go sky's the limit. We have to figure out the balance and where the healthcare dollars are best spent. I believe that in pharmaceuticals, those are good spends normally, but we have to look at the price calculation and figure out what makes sense. Thank you.
Thank you all so much. That was just a wonderful discussion. Many people end up watching this live, but it's recorded and made part of our website so that people can return to it. And I really think there's a lot to be learned from what you guys have shared today. So in advance of, I know the CEPAC members will likely share their appreciation as well. I just want to thank you for the time, for the guidance that we've received from many of you over months, again, not just today, and for your collaborative spirit. So thank you. Reem, let me hand it back over to you to let the CEPAC members have their last say.
Thank you, Steve, and thanks to everybody who participated in this very, very really thoughtful, collaborative spirit during the policy roundtable, which was very informative. I'm going to leave my sentence to the end, and I'm going to ask my colleagues from the Midwest CEPAC to turn on their cameras, and I'll be calling on them to give us their final thoughts. And I'm going to go actually in random order. So I would start with Dr. Stacy Dussetsina.
Thanks, Reem. I just want to say a heartfelt thank you, especially to the patients who have been here today. I think it was an incredible help to hear your stories and really appreciate your engagement. You know, I guess my reflection here goes back to one of the comments that Kathy made about the trade-offs on spending dollars on drugs versus spending dollars on other things, and how much need there is for patients and their caregivers. And I think that is one of the elephants in the room often. You know, we know that the health insurance company won't necessarily cut you a check to make up that difference to spend on other things, but we really are dealing with trade-offs when we think about what we spend on one service versus others. So, you know, I think reiterating that point, that there is a lot of need, financial and otherwise, and we are making decisions that result in trade-offs in one way or another. But again, thank you for such an excellent meeting and for being here, especially for the patients.
Thank you so much, Stacy. Sneha Dave.
Yeah, well, this is definitely, I don't know if I can say this, but one of the most interesting and thought-provoking ICER meetings that I've been a part of. I particularly really appreciated getting to hear from patients who are diagnosed maybe earlier in their age span than we would typically hear from. So that was really, you know, just, I guess, thought-provoking in a lot of ways. And I also just really wanted to echo what Kathy said about you know, potentially putting some more onus on the manufacturers as well, and really thinking about this issue as a holistic issue, and you know, thinking about patient access is, again, holistic and not sort of just a payer problem, but everyone is part of the health system problem. So again, really appreciated being here and hearing all the perspectives today.
Thank you, Sneha. Tim Weld.
Thanks. So sadly and really frustratingly, I believe the science is just not clear on the effectiveness of these therapies for a devastating illness where there are few to no other therapies. ALS patients, as well as all of our patients, really deserve and need solid science to make well-informed decisions and to move the research and clinical care forward. I ask that we move in that direction in the future.
Thanks, Tim. I'm going to go to Don Casey next.
Thank you, Reem. I echo the sentiments of the CEPAC in terms of the tremendous value this has brought to my way of thinking. My statement is what I said earlier in the day. I think there needs to be an evolution of an explicit and specific structure and process for advanced care planning for ALS patients and their caregivers, so as to improve the evidence, the quality of evidence for effective shared decision-making in research and practice, remembering that advanced care planning is about how you want to live, not how you want to die. Thank you.
Thank you, Don. Gregory.
Thank you, Reem. ALS, like end-stage kidney disease, has a dual coverage pathway. Every patient at the time of diagnosis will be covered by Medicare, but as many as half the 30,000 patients in the country with ALS have private insurance coverage. And as a new expensive drug, AMX, may be coming on the market, a concern that I have is that private insurers may begin to try to force ALS patients over onto Medicare. This has happened with end-stage kidney disease for exactly the same reason. Dialysis is very expensive. Private insurers don't want to cover it. And so they think of ways of moving patients over onto Medicare. And with the $2,000 limit on out-of-pocket payment, that may work all right, but it is going to put pressure on the Medicare fisc. So I think that this is something that we may want to keep an eye on as things go forward and see how this plays out. This has been a wonderful conference today. Thanks to everyone.
Thank you, Gregory. Tim McBride,
I'm having trouble with my camera. Can you hear me?
we can hear you well.
Okay, I'll just talk and you won't have a camera. I think my computer went to sleep in the meantime. I want to thank the ICER staff and Steve for great work, and Reem for your sharing this amazing meeting, and the patient experts and clinical experts for really tough situation. And it I want to echo the thought that I wish we had more and better data to make these decisions. I think we did the best we could in this circumstance. You know, the issue that I'm concerned about is the high costs of this drug, these drugs. And I also just sort of want to say this because it came along while we were hearing comments, and I just want to bring it out, is the issue about home health and the workforce issues. I work a lot in rural health, and that's a really big challenge in rural areas. And so I thought it was really important that got brought up.
Thank you, Timothy. Bradley Martin.
I guess a couple of thoughts. One, when the patients and clinicians during the comment, they seem to take sharpen their knives at some of the things in the evidence reports. I will say I was moved by the patients and perhaps accepting evidence because of the profound severity of the disease, was able to look over some of the warts and some of the evidence. But I was really moved by the open label extension and there's survival benefits. I think that was, I think, very telling and I think leads to credible. But so I think that's the first point. The second, I think some of the knives that were sharpened at the evidence report, I think I was kind of surprised that it's kind of the messenger that's taking the attack, but the manufacturers that, you know, have these incredibly highly priced products are really the reason. I think there's evidence that these products can work. I don't think it's solid, but I think the value proposition, we're a long way from where these could be translated into something that would be value that provides, that society could maybe provide access to all the persons that really need this.
Thanks, Bradley. Aaron Carroll.
Yeah, I don't want to repeat what others have already said, but I think that I would just add that I'm always sort of struck that when people are talking about how they don't think it's fair that that groups are minimizing you know, how much of a difference these can make. I'm always sort of struck by that. We're not saying they don't work. We're saying that they're cost too much. And that I wish there was more attention paid to the fact that these prices are so high, and and if the prices were lower, we would have more money to do these other things as well. And so that there's two sides to the cost effectiveness. It's not just are they effective, but also how much do they cost?
Thanks, Aaron. Jill Johnson.
Thanks, Reem. I think today's conversation was super balanced, and I appreciate everyone's insight. The staff did a superb job, just as usual. I thought the roundtable was very informative. I don't know if I just listened more closely or for whatever reason, but I thought it was very thought-provoking regarding just another super expensive drug. I think the experts today were super helpful to me too, pointing out these shortfalls in the evidence that, you know, helps put into perspective ideas that this dry evidence really sometimes fails to point out. So thank you.
Thank you, Jill. Heather Guidon.
First, of course, I want to thank everyone who shared their lived experiences, the patients, the caregivers. That was just so incredibly important to hear from them. And I really struggled with today because I will be honest, you know, there probably isn't a community I wanted to help more and do more for today. And it just really reminds me that, you know, sometimes through these meetings and in our own works, you know, our day jobs, sometimes we really struggle with the evidence. And I am reminded yet again that, you know, what we see on paper doesn't necessarily always capture real life scenarios and real lived experiences. So I would just, you know, to my own self and to my colleagues, just continually remind myself that, you know, what we do needs to be patient-centric, and we need to find a way to work together within this framework that we have in healthcare and in policy, so that we can ensure that people can get access to the care and the drugs that they need. You know, we're not deciding necessarily prices, we're deciding access to care for human beings. But I, for one, am very grateful to be a part of this panel and for the work, the hard work that ICER does. So thank you. This was a tough one, but I'm grateful to be here.
Thank you, Heather. Eric Armbruck.
So I've been involved with a lot of ICER cases, and it's been a privilege each time, but none has been more personal than this one. My dad lived with ALS, and I wish that patients and their caregivers, right, didn't feel so alone. And I wish that the treatments were more effective. And I guess I wish that our scientific knowledge of the disease was greater, right? I think one of the interesting questions that came up today that I hadn't quite thought about is, like, you know, can the economic analysis that we do, or that we did today, be discriminatory against ALS, right? And even for my very personal connection to this particular topic, I arrived at the answer of no, not today. It was not discriminatory against people with ALS. It turns out that the science is incomplete and the price is too high. But that's kind of my reflection, you know, on it. Just and I just really appreciate everybody today in so many ways, and in so many ways that I can't even quite communicate. So thanks for just a wonderful session. And I hope this advances the education of payers and policymakers on this particular topic, because that also surfaced today, of just how far we have to go, you know, as people trying to push health policy in a number of topics, but particularly this one. So thanks, Reem.
Thank you, Eric. Alan Balch.
Hi, sorry, I agree with everything that's been said so far. I guess the only thing I could add, and this is not a very positive comment, but it just struck me as I listened to this whole conversation, how ALS in particular is such a really good case study of how poorly the whole system doesn't work for a particular disease area. And so it's easy to point the finger at, you know, and we tend to do, well, it's the insurance company not providing access, it's the science that's incomplete, it's the drug companies' prices are too high. I actually think it's everything. It's no one person's fault. It's just it's the perfect storm of factors that make this a really horrible disease to have to deal with, in a system that doesn't really, from all aspects, you know, in terms of what's covered and the support for caregivers and home healthcare, home support, to the science, and to the, you know, the need for physicians that have the ability to, you know, customize their care to the needs of the patient, and the need that things have to happen quickly, which, you know, of course, the insurance companies are, you know, reticent to move quickly because things are expensive. So they use the tools at their disposal. And of course, if you're a manufacturer and you want to allocate resources to an area where there's not a lot of innovation, and, you know, you're bringing something new to the marketplace, hasn't been there in 30 years, and it's a small portion of the population, of course the price is going to be high. I mean, what else would it be? So nothing about our health system works. So that's, and I wish I don't know, it seems like a place where to think very differently about, and I don't know if you can do it for one disease area, but if there was one, I think trying to be innovative, but not just with the therapy, but with the whole way we approach care and insurance and coverage for this population. It's a good case study for trying to do something completely different.
Thank you, Ellen. I believe we've heard from all CEPAC members who are on the call now. And I would like to thank few people. I would start with members of the Midwest CEPAC for your thoughtfulness, for the sincerity and everybody really here wanting to understand and come to the best possible conclusion, given the limitations of and the context that we're dealing with. I also want to thank definitely the ICER staff for organizing a very smooth meeting. I want to thank the both authors of the clinical effectiveness and the cost effectiveness, and wonderful presentations, really organized and helpful. I want to thank everybody who participated in the policy roundtable, our clinical experts, but I want to especially thank the people with ALS and caregivers who were willing to share their stories with all of us. And I can speak for myself and many of my colleagues. It did make a difference in how we looked at things, and definitely gave context that we otherwise would not have had, especially for those who did not have family members or people who knew with ALS. And maybe I will end on, this is clearly showing limitations at many levels, what we discussed today, but we really need new tools and new kits that will support creative pricing and policy decisions. What we have so far just does not work for definitely for ALS, but it is an excellent case example how it doesn't work for many other conditions. And hopefully with finding creative ways for pricing and policy decisions, that we will be able to support more access for everybody with ALS who wants or needs more medications, more care at different levels. So again, thank you all for a very, very rich discussion, informative discussion. And thanks, Steve, for wonderful moderation for very tough topics. So I'll give it back to you.
Thank you. You guys are thoughtful and eloquent, indeed. And I'll come back to that. I was reflecting earlier that, I've witnessed, kind of shadowed a variety of different pharmacy and therapeutic committee kind of meetings across the years of different insurers, different even hospital groups where they're making decisions about allocating resources. And at least in a lot of the occasions, they're covering a lot of different drugs in a single sitting. And they might have 10 to 15 minutes to cover a new drug. Every once in a while, a little bit more time. And that's it. And the richness of the discussion today, particularly in the policy roundtable and through the public comments, I really hope that we at ICER can continue to have our platform be one through which payers, I wish I could make everyone sit down and watch the whole thing, because to learn from those lived experiences, to learn from the commentary from the patients and the clinical experts throughout the roundtable, I just think, how could they not have that in their heads when they sit down, the insurers, to make their coverage policy? So I hope that we can continue to expand the education by their ability to listen to these different perspectives. That being said, I'm just going to pivot to say that as I started out, when these new drugs are approved, there is a sense of celebration, and nowhere else would that be more true than for ALS. In terms of the severity of the condition, the broad impact on people's lives, and yet the anxiety that it raises because our system is so fractured and broken. And I'm just worried that, as Alan said, we're kind of rebuilding the same problems. We're going to have a drug that seems grossly overpriced for its added clinical benefit that we know today. That is going to lead in some way or other through our competitive free market insurance system to constraints on access. They're going to be competing to make sure that they're not the easiest health plan to get treatment on. That's the way our system works. And patients are going to fight, right? Their advocacy groups are going to say, this is what we do. We fight against the insurers. And so this is the normal story we tell. And meanwhile, we want to become, I've heard this several times now from some groups, we want to become the next oncology. And by that is meant, we want lots of innovation. And what it doesn't usually include is drugs that are used in combination at extremely high prices, that if diversified over a broader number of patients in the US healthcare system, will absolutely cripple our ability to provide healthcare. And all those patients and people that we talked about at the very beginning are going to continue to suffer in ways seen and unseen. And I hate the fact that we're still stuck in that rut and that we're still going to be pushing uphill despite the bill that was just passed in Washington, which is going to take a little nip out of the end of some of this, but might even accelerate the increase in launch prices that have been a critical feature of the landscape as well. So much work to do. And my request would be for everybody to pattern themselves after Kathy Collett in her graciousness, in her honesty, in her broad-mindedness. She's the way that this gets fixed. She has an ability to say, and we need innovation, access, and reasonable pricing. And if people in the patient, the organized patient community could take that approach, and in the clinical specialty society community, do you really want to become the next oncology, where you're going to be talking about the financial toxicity to your patients for years as their combination treatments mount between 5 and 500,000 and $1 million? We all have to be kind of, in some sense, responsible for saying, and we want these things, and we can have other things if we work together to create an affordable, sustainable platform. We still can have innovation, and we can have better access if we do this together. So this is a job for generations, and we're on that journey, and we still have a lot of work to do. But the collaborative spirit, again, of the people who came today for our policy roundtable, the work that we all do in thinking about the evidence, because in that mix, I'm old enough to have seen a lot of promising drugs have one study with 60 people in the treatment arm and 60 in the placebo group, and we still don't really know the safety. We still don't really know much about the effectiveness. And to take a lot of leaps off of that platform into expensive treatment options for patients is difficult to think of generalizing without doing real harm. So we need to figure out how to fix that, how to get the innovation, how to get it accessible. And I think that we do the best we can by coming and just talking about it honestly and trying to wrestle with this and trying to send signals to the powers that be that this information matters. It matters for patients today, and it'll matter tomorrow. And we have to get better at creating a system that will incentivize every participant to collaborate to do better in their part. So I really appreciate all of your guys' contributions to the meeting today. To my own team that's been working on this report for 8 months, I'm going to pat them on the back because they were spectacular. I agree with you. And we have more work to do on the next meeting for this group and for others. So in the meantime, I hope you will be well. And let's hope that we can meet in the future to talk about other future treatment options for patients with ALS, and that we're talking about multi-year gains in survival and more studies and lots to do, and including hopefully prices that have moderated so that patients and the system can afford it. So with that, I've already gone way past my 1 semicolon, but thank you very much. And I look forward to seeing you at our next meeting.
Thank you, Stephen. Thanks to everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. See you.